In 1771, inside the royal palace of Stockholm, a royal body lay slumped over a chair, pale, purple, suffocated. In front of him, the aftermath of a massacre at the table, empty lobster shells, scraped off caviar, pieces of meat, sauces dripping from the edges, and at the center, 14 sweet rolls soaked in boiling milk, still floating as silent witnesses to the tragedy. The man who wore a crown but wielded no power died trying to devour his own emptiness. It wasn't murder. It wasn't poison. It was gluttony. Gluttony for power, for control, for compensation. Adolf Frederick didn't lose his life to swords or conspiracies. He lost it by swallowing alone the humiliation served to him on porcelain. And if you, like me, enjoy true stories that challenge what the history books tell us, subscribe now so you don't miss the next chapters, and tell me in the comments, which country are you watching from? I'm always curious to see how far this reaches. He was born far from the crown, the throne, and the pomp. No prophet announced his name. No general planned a future of conquests. Adolf Frederick entered the world in 1710, in a noble but unremarkable house in what is now German territory. The son of a duke, he was just another young man of the middle aristocracy, raised to obey, manage, and uphold the family name, not to rule a nation. In his youth, his future seemed already decided. A bureaucratic career in some secondary court, perhaps a comfortable life surrounded by books, hunting, and social conventions. Nothing pointed to the idea that this shy young man, with his plain looks and restrained manner, would one day wear a crown. But destiny, when driven by political alliances and the interests of foreign powers, can push even the most unlikely into the center of history. And that's exactly what happened to him. It wasn't glory that brought him to the throne. There was no popular acclaim, no direct lineage that legitimized him as Sweden's natural heir. Adolf Frederick was placed there, like a piece positioned on the board of a larger game. It was the 18th century, and the European powers were battling for influence in the north with sharp teeth. Sweden, already weakened after the death of Charles I and a period of instability, had become vulnerable to foreign manipulation. And into that power vacuum, Adolf emerged as the solution, not because of his own merits or ambition, but because he was the least threatening name among the options. Russia, under the regency of Elizabeth, needed a docile ally. France, on the other hand, wanted to contain Russian expansion, but preferred a predictable king over a volatile leader. Adolf Frederick, lacking charisma, military background, and political clout, seemed ideal. He was pleasing because he wasn't intimidating. He served because he didn't resist. In 1743, he was elected Crown Prince of Sweden, not through celebration, but through convenience. An arrangement sewn together by diplomats, signed with promises of balance and submission. He, born in Schleswig-Holstein as the son of a mediocre German duke, was now heir to a Scandinavian throne. Even he didn't believe it. According to reports, his reaction was more discomfort than excitement, and rightly so. He knew he wasn't chosen to lead, but to obey. Years later, when he was finally crowned king, the mood in Sweden was far from celebratory. The people saw him as a puppet of foreign interests. The political elite, especially the factions known as the Hats and Caps, treated the new monarch with disdain. He came to the throne with the same authority as a statue in a plaza, present but ignored, and he knew it. There was no honor in the gesture that placed him there. There was calculation, there was control, and there was a silent awkwardness surrounding his figure, as if everyone knew he was nothing more than a royal formality, a crowned figurehead meant to preserve appearances. Adolf Frederick didn't rise. He was pushed. And that crown, which looked so heavy in paintings, weighed just as much on his conscience. To be King of Sweden at that time didn't mean ruling. It meant waiting. waiting for permission to travel, waiting for approval to sign, waiting for Parliament to decide even the simplest gestures of court life. Adolf Frederick wore the crown, but didn't hold the scepter. Every one of his decisions had to pass through the scrutiny of politicians who openly despised him. The throne was symbolic, and he knew it from the first day. The Swedish constitution had turned the monarch into a decorative figure. The real power belonged to the parties that alternated control, especially the Hats, who favored a militaristic stance aligned with France, and the Caps, advocates of peaceful policies close to Russia. Adolf, lacking firmness and political skill, was swallowed by these disputes. He tried to please both sides and ended up displeasing everyone. In public, he was treated with forced formality. In private, with sarcasm. The British ambassador, in a letter to London, wrote that Sweden is the only place where even the king needs permission to leave his own house. And that wasn't an exaggeration. He didn't have access to the royal seal, the highest symbol of governmental authority. Documents only became valid with the approval of parliamentary leaders. He was the king who couldn't rule. This powerlessness didn't enrage him, it paralyzed him. And it was precisely this passivity that fueled the elite's contempt. He didn't fight. He didn't resist. He accepted everything with resignation, a stance that in a turbulent political setting looked like cowardice. Even his own servants noted in letters and journals the king's permanently submissive air. Adolf was seen as a pale figure, a porcelain king surrounded by wolves. This royal impotence corroded not only his public image, but also his personal identity. He wasn't heard. He wasn't feared. He wasn't even necessary. His role was to smile in portraits and show up at ceremonies, nothing more. And over time, that formal exclusion became something even deeper. Adolf Frederick turned into a king who didn't belong even to his own monarchy, a spectator in the politics of his own kingdom, a king who didn't even command his own fate. If the crown felt light on Adolf Frederick's head, it was because the real weight rested on the shoulders of Louisa Ulrika. She wasn't just a queen consort. She was a daughter of Prussia, sister to one of the most feared monarchs in Europe, and a woman who firmly believed that power should be seized, not granted. When she married Adolf, she expected to find a partner in governance, but what she found was a man with no pulse, no ambition, and no voice. He took refuge in wood, literally. While the court burned with political disputes, the king isolated himself in his workshop, carving boxes, spoons, chess pieces. His carpentry was his private kingdom, a miniature universe where no one questioned him, where he could finally control something. But for Louisa, this was more than cowardice. It was betrayal of the role he had sworn to play. She despised him, and she didn't hide it. She called him the gardener king in front of advisors, mocked his silence during important meetings, and often took the lead in palace decisions. Rumors ran wild through the corridors of Stockholm. They said she was the one truly ruling, while her husband busied himself with tools and desserts. The queen wanted to restore the authority of the crown. She wanted to confront Parliament, rewrite the constitution, return to the throne the power that the parties had stripped away. But every time she looked at Adolf, she saw an obstacle, not an ally. And instead of encouraging him to fight back, she began to smother him with contempt. He, in turn, withdrew more with each criticism. The more she pressured him, the more he hid. Their relationship was a silent duel, not of swords, but of expectations. While she accumulated frustrations, he accumulated sugar, fat, and silence. There was no affection. There was calculation. Louisa saw her husband as a fragile bridge between her and power, a bridge she intended to use until she no longer needed it. In that divided court, where everyone knew who really ruled, Adolf Frederick was just the name stamped on coins. And even inside his own home, sitting beside a woman who should have lifted him up, he was constantly reminded that his presence didn't command respect, it inspired pity. For years, Adolf Frederick was treated as a political ornament, but in 1756, something changed, or rather, someone forced a change. Louisa Ulrika, impatient with her husband's uselessness and thirsty for power, devised a bold plan, a coup d'état to restore absolute monarchy in Sweden. She had secret allies, outlined strategies, and unwavering conviction. The problem was him, the king. Adolf had no courage, no initiative, but he had the title, and that was what she needed. Pressured by the Queen, the king agreed to lead what was supposed to be the triumphant return of royal command over the country. But nothing went as planned. The plan was weak, the conspirators disorganized, and Parliament's spies were always one step ahead. What was meant to be a secret uprising became a public scandal. The conspirators were arrested within days. Some were hanged, others exiled, and Adolf, he came out even smaller than he went in. Not only did the coup fail, it proved to all of Sweden what had already been whispered in the halls of power for years. Even with help, he didn't know how to rule. The Queen was officially spared, but her influence was marked, and Adolf Frederick paid a high price. If he had already been a king without power, now he became a king under surveillance. His steps were watched, his decisions monitored. Parliament further reduced his autonomy, like punishing a child who had tried to play with fire. The attempt to reclaim authority ended in public defeat, reinforcing his image as a weak and manipulable figure. The people lost what little respect they still had, and his political enemies, smiling inside, began to treat him with condescension. The king who tried to stage a coup became the king who could barely raise his own voice. It was the turning point. From that moment on, Adolf Frederick seemed to give up any political ambition. That failed attempt to regain control of the throne was also the symbolic end of his will, and the beginning of a silent resignation, a slow and painful surrender to the role of figurehead king, living among shadows, memories, and silverware. After the failed coup, something broke in Adolf Frederick, and it wasn't just his public image. It was as if, for the first time, he understood that no matter what he did, he would never have control. He would never be heard. He would never truly govern. From that point on, he gave up any effort to appear kingly, and he immersed himself in the only two places where he still felt like someone, the workshop and the dining table. Carpentry wasn't just a pastime, it was an escape. There, among wood, varnish and tools, the king created small objects with his own hands. Snuff boxes, picture frames, game pieces, every precise cut, every silent joint was a way of restoring order in a world that treated him like an accessory. The court viewed this with disdain. The nobles whispered, "While the country sinks, the king sands wood." But for him, it was the only place where no one interrupted him. But not even wood was enough. Over time, Adolf Frederick began seeking comfort in something more immediate and more destructive: food. The banquets, once mere ceremonial events, turned into intimate rituals. Private meals became feasts, dinners with 10 courses, desserts in succession, wine, butter, meat and sugar, a lot of sugar. Court physicians discreetly recorded the excesses. They knew the king ate like someone trying to fill a hole that wasn't physical. He didn't eat to nourish himself. He ate to forget. He ate to silence the voices that diminished him. He ate because in that moment, no one could take away his right to choose. The palace kitchen began operating under the king's direct orders. He chose the dishes, demanded double portions, invented combinations, requested sweets found only in old cookbooks. And the cooks, out of fear or pity, obeyed. Eating was the only act where he was still a king, and everyone knew it. While politics crumbled, the economy collapsed, and the people starved, inside the gilded halls, Adolf Frederick served himself. Alone, before plates that spoke more of his despair than his appetite. And no one dared stop him, because deep down, everyone knew. To take that plate from him would be to strip him of his last crumb of power. Adolf Frederick's body was speaking, screaming, pleading, but he didn't listen. Each excessive meal was followed by abdominal pain, sweating fits, nausea, chronic fatigue. And still, he continued. It was as if the king was determined to ignore his own limits, perhaps because the only thing he could command, without interference, was his own collapse. The doctors tried everything. They wrote handwritten recommendations, urging moderation. They sent discreet letters to the Queen's advisers. They suggested alternative, less fatty menus, but none of them were heard. Adolf would smile politely and return to the kitchen where his wishes still carried the weight of orders. The truth was clear to everyone inside the palace. He didn't want healing. He wanted comfort, and the comfort was heavy. Smoked pork, thick cream sauces, bread filled with almond paste and topped with whipped cream, and wine. Lots of wine. Court witnesses reported that at certain dinners, the king consumed alone the equivalent of what would feed an entire family for 2 days. But no one dared interrupt him, because that hunger wasn't physical, it was political, it was existential. Every dish was a shield against shame, every bite a silent protest against the emptiness around him. He ate like someone trying to keep the world from collapsing. But what was slowly collapsing was him. His clothes started to tighten. His stride shortened. His breathing became labored. In less than 5 years, the king had turned into a bloated, sluggish, and visibly ill man, yet always with a timid smile when being served. The medical letters from that time are almost desperate. One doctor even reported clear signs of humor failure, an 18th-century medical term we would now translate as severe metabolic insufficiency. Even so, Adolf Frederick ignored the warnings. He sat at the table like someone facing the only territory where he was still respected, and there he stayed, chewing slowly, while his own body signaled surrender. There were no rebellions against the king, but there was a war happening inside him, and he was losing, because no crown can withstand the insistence on filling a spiritual void with layers of fat, sugar, and denial. And he knew it. But between dying of emotional hunger and dying of excess, he had made his choice long ago. It was February 1771. Winter blanketed Stockholm in icy silence, but inside the palace the atmosphere was different. It was Fat Tuesday, the last day of indulgence before Lent, and Adolf Frederick decided there would be no limits that night. No restraint, no decorum, no prudence. The table would be his court, the plate his territory, and the banquet his final decree. He began with abundant starters: smoked herring, sauerkraut, caviar, lobster soaked in thick sauces. The servant said he was as giddy as a child, that he laughed to himself between bites, as if mocking his own story. Then came the meats: cured pork, stuffed veal, roasted birds. The king chewed with an almost theatrical urgency, as if trying to defeat something or someone with every bite. But the climax came with dessert. He demanded semlas, the traditional Swedish sweet rolls filled with almond paste and topped with cream. It was his favorite treat. 1 wasn't enough. 2 didn't satisfy. He ate 3, 5, 10, until he reached 14. 14 sweet rolls soaked in hot milk, consumed one after another before a court that no longer knew whether to serve him or to witness a live tragedy unfolding. That night, Adolf Frederick went beyond any physical limit. His already swollen body began to react. He broke into cold sweat. His chest tightened. His hands trembled. But he continued. It was as if he wanted to prove something, not to others, but to himself. As if by controlling that banquet, he could reclaim a glory he never had. Hours later, the first pain struck like a silent thunder. He staggered, slumped into a chair. His face lost color. Silence fell instantly over the hall. Doctors were summoned in a rush. They tried bloodletting, hot poultices, herbal infusions, but it was too late. The king no longer responded. The banquet that had begun as a celebration had turned into a funeral scene. By dawn the next day, the news spread among the servants in hushed astonishment. The king was dead, not from war, not from poisoning, but from a ruptured stomach, defeated by his own gluttony. That night wasn't marked merely by an absurd death. It became the ultimate proof that Adolf Frederick, the man who never had power, chose to die in the one place he could still command, at the table. The news spread through the palace with the weight of a dirty secret. The king was dead, but no one really knew how to say it out loud. To say a monarch was undone by his own stomach, by gluttony, by desert, it was too offensive, but too true to be ignored. And as the servants discreetly cleared away the remnants of the previous night's feast, the court prepared to stage a mourning that no one truly felt. The funeral was held with all the rituals required by royal protocol: procession, hymns, flower wreaths. But behind the black garments and measured speeches lingered an unmistakable discomfort. How do you honor a king who spent his life being ignored and in the end became a national joke? The speakers, embarrassed, praised vague virtues: piety, serenity, a good heart, but none dared mention the cause of death. None had the courage to say, he died because he ate too much. Among ministers and parliamentarians, the mood was one of quiet relief. Many saw him as a passive obstacle, a decorative burden in a system that had already moved past him. With his death, the political machine could run more smoothly. His absence wasn't a loss, it was a release. And deep down, everyone knew it. Among the people, the reaction was even more bitter. In the same week as the funeral, satirical pamphlets began circulating in Stockholm. One showed the king with his belly bursting, surrounded by chicken bones and spilled pies. Another depicted death serving semlas while the king applauded with hunger. They were grotesque illustrations, but accurate. And what hurt the royal memory most was precisely that. The people weren't mocking an exaggeration. They were mocking a truth. Louisa Ulrika, now a widow, assumed the role of mourning wife with the coldness that had always defined her. There were no public tears, no genuine words of sorrow, only silent plans on how to redirect succession through her son, Gustav. For her, that funeral wasn't the end of an era, it was an opportunity. The husband she despised was off the stage, and with that, the political game gained a new piece in motion. Adolf Frederick was buried with pomp, but not with respect. He was laid to rest among kings who had shaped Swedish history with swords and decrees, while he left behind only a warning: even nobility can rot from swallowing what it cannot rule. The death of a king usually prompts mourning, formal condolences, and ceremonies in other courts. But what followed Adolf Frederick's death was something completely different. When news reached the capitals of Europe, the respectful silence that usually accompanies such events was broken by stifled laughter, biting comments, and diplomatic sarcasm. The King of Sweden had died, not of plague, not of treason, but of gluttony. And for other monarchs, that was far too comical to mourn. In Versailles, the Swedish ambassador was left speechless when Louis XIV reacted to the news with a mixture of astonishment and mockery. "Dying from sweet bread," the French king reportedly said. "That's fit for Molière, not a crown." The court's hall, they say, laughed discreetly but intensely. After all, what kind of sovereign can't even control his own appetite? In Berlin, Frederick the Great, the deceased's brother-in-law, was less restrained. In private letters he wrote, "My sister deserved a husband more useful, both at the table and on the throne." His contempt wasn't new, but the way he used the tragedy to reaffirm Adolf's weakness was cutting. In Frederick's view, his brother-in-law hadn't just failed as a king. He had ridiculed himself as a man. And even in St. Petersburg, where Catherine the Great typically maintained a diplomatic stance toward her Scandinavian neighbors, the irony slipped through. When informed of the cause of death, she reportedly replied coldly, "In Russia, men die by sword or poison. In Sweden, they prefer dessert." A dry and deadly remark. What was once an irrelevant name in power circles became the subject of international mockery. Instead of reverence, his end inspired ridicule. Instead of condolences, jokes. Instead of posthumous recognition, caricatures. The death of Adolf Frederick spread across Europe as a living, or dead, example of the decadent excesses of a monarchy that had lost control even over its own habits. More than the death of a king, what was announced to Europe that winter was the symbolic collapse of a model of power, because if even a monarch surrounded by gold and advisors dies choking on his own vanity, then nothing is untouchable anymore. And the world understood. It smiled and moved on. Adolf Frederick's coffin had barely cooled, and his son Gustav was already moving with surgical precision. There was no time for prolonged mourning, no room for sentimentality. What he saw in his father's body was not inheritance, but warning. Gustav did not want to repeat the story of a king ignored, ridiculed, and defeated by his own silence. He wanted to be remembered, and above all, feared. Less than 2 years after his father's death, Gustav III did what Adolf never managed to do. He seized absolute control of the kingdom. In a skillfully planned coup d'état, he dissolved parliament, rewrote the constitution, and restored the monarchy's authority. Without blood, without shouting, without chaos. He did it all with the same coldness with which his mother, Louisa Ulrika, had raised him. His father's name was barely mentioned during the process. Gustav presented himself as the opposite of the previous king. Where Adolf was passive, he was decisive. Where the father was a caricature, he became a symbol of a new era. Paintings, coins, and speeches began discreetly omitting the deceased's image. The son wanted to bury not only the body, but the legacy. There would be no room for the dessert king in his new reign. For Louisa Ulrika, the move was almost a posthumous revenge. She, who had spent years being dragged down by her husband's slowness and inertia, now watched her son execute everything she had dreamed of. Gustav not only returned power to the crown, he rewrote history. And he made sure his father's memory disappeared into the background. Adolf Frederick thus became an uncomfortable footnote, an example of what not to be, a portrait no one wanted to hang. And that may have been even crueler than the satirical pamphlets or the laughter of foreigners. Because it was his own family, his own blood, that treated his existence as a mistake to be corrected. The son succeeded where the father failed, and to do so he had to erase everything that came before. Adolf left no legacy, only a warning, and Gustav, upon taking power, used it as fuel. Because sometimes, before building a new monarchy, you must first bury the shame of the previous one, without looking back. Adolf Frederick never led glorious armies, never shaped memorable laws, nor was he beloved by the people. In life, he was ignored, corrected, used, and often hidden. But it was precisely his death, grotesque, pathetic, almost unbelievable, that secured him a place in history, not for his merits, but for the mockery, not for greatness, but for spectacular failure. Nearly 3 centuries later, few Swedes could list his political deeds, but many can recite with a smirk on their lips the cause of death. He was the king who ate 14 semlas and died, and everyone laughs. Schools don't teach his policies, but bakeries sell the pastry that killed him, and every year, on Fat Tuesday, millions of Swedes buy the same little buns soaked in hot milk, as if symbolically reenacting a king's final breath. It's cruel, and at the same time, it's human. Adolf Frederick became a historical anecdote, a warning disguised as a joke. His face still appears in lists of the most bizarre deaths. His name circulates in blogs, videos, and memes, and every time someone mentions his end, it's not out of reverence, it's out of disbelief. He died where he thought he still had some power, at the table. His end became a symbol of what happens when a man, with no place in the real world, tries to rule the only kingdom left to him, his own plate. That's why, even rejected in life, he remains present in every semler sold, in every stifled laugh, in every historical curiosity that begins with, "Did you know a king died from eating too much?" And maybe that's his most lasting legacy. Not castles, not treaties, not alliances, but the reminder that even the most insignificant of kings can become eternal, if he falls in the most absurd way possible. Because history doesn't only cling to heroes, it also preserves fools. And sometimes it's the fools who survive time with the most force. Adolf Frederick didn't leave behind a dynasty of glory, but he left a portrait, grotesque, ironic, real, of what happens when a man becomes a subject to his own weakness. And that's why, even today, he's remembered, not for what he did, but for what he couldn't restrain. He lived as a footnote in European politics. He died as a headline of ridicule. Adolf Frederick was a king without a voice, without drive, without legacy, until the day his own excess made him eternal. His end became a joke, a pamphlet, a historical curiosity, and finally, a lesson. Because in the end, what killed this king wasn't sugar, nor the banquet. It was the desperate attempt to control the only territory that still obeyed him, his own appetite. And if this true story impressed you as much as it did me, subscribe now, because in the next video you'll hear another breathtaking true story. One of those that don't appear in history books, but that truth insists on not letting disappear. After all, history doesn't forget the great, but it never forgives those who fall in memorable fashion.